Welcome to this episode of DeepTech Studio. We have with us Sijo George, who's the Executive Director of ADIF. He will talk to us about how the startup playbook needs to transform for the India market and for the next generation. ADIF is also advocating for policies for startup ecosystem, and let's know about their stand in advocating for the same policies. And he'll also talk to us about the evolution of deep tech market. Thank you, Sijo. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. Welcome on board.
Thanks, Vaishnavi. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for hosting.
Sijo, how does ADIF aim to transform the playbook for the next generation of digital startups?
So, from a broader objective of where ADIF comes in from, so the founders and backers of ADIF are essentially beneficiaries of the startup. I myself have been a founder myself, and I did my startup right after college. And when we started out, we were in the super, let's say, early stages of the whole startup ecosystem evolving, right? Even my batchmates were unaware of even the keyword startup right now, at that point in time. Now, 10, 15 years down the line, when we are in 2022, we already have few of our startups who sort of started around the 2005, 2008 timeline, get into even the Nifty 50. Last year was the year of IPOs. Some of our marquee companies also went in. So I would probably say we are in an inflection point in terms of saying that has been a coming of age. This is a genuine asset class. It's not just a sector that is supposed to be a sunrise sector and hopefully coming down. So at this point in time, there are two parts to the story. One is the fact that everybody in the space, including me, we believe that it's only from now on that we really get to see the growth on what the promise of the sector really promises, right? And that is over the next a decade or two. On the other part of the story is all of us have been beneficiaries of the space, and a lot of people have helped out. So it is obviously a need and a moral responsibility for us to make sure that we provide effort and leadership and initiative to fuel the next cycle of entrepreneurship in the country, right? And this will come in our understanding in two, three, broad interventions, right? How do we come about that? How do we fuel the next cycle of entrepreneurship? One obviously is making sure we have the right regulatory or the policy ecosystem in terms of making sure that we support the sector to grow a lot. A fair amount of the work that we do in ADIF is actually around the policy advocacy space. The simplest way for us to understand that is, see, all of our entrepreneurs and founders who have gotten startup sector to this particular point where we are talking about it as a mainstream sector today, everybody has shown tremendous imagination and effort to bring it to this particular point in time in terms of building their companies, right? What we are now trying to say is that we need a similar imagination effort even on the policy areas as well, to make sure that we have a conducive startup ecosystem to fuel this growth in terms of making it one of the best startup markets in the world as well. So this is one part of how we believe that intervention needed, right? And that's where a fair amount of work in ADIF is going into. The second part, where at the end of the day, entrepreneurship is also part of a culture. What really distinguishes the entrepreneurship of the startup market in comparison to some of the other markets I've participated in, and that's my deep excitement to be the part of the startup market, is this whole culture of, let's say, sharing and helping others. That camaraderie built on even, let's say, the open technology stack, right? That's where the roots of all the startup culture comes in from. Enable that, we also need a lot of steps in that particular direction. If we were to bring it down into two elements where we're looking at ADI, one is the fact that we want to now create a more informal network of knowledge sharing between the founders, what we call the club ADIF, right? See, most of these founders are navigating these issues for the first time in their life, right? Raising $1 billion of capital or getting to IPO. And some of these problems or the issues that they have navigated, helping the next set of founders can only really learn from people who have been there and done that. And these happen through informal relationships. And one way that sort of starts manifesting, if you started observing the way the market's evolving, you'll see some of the founders who've been there and done that being on cap tables of founders who come after, right? it's not really about the money. It's also about the fact that you need access to the network and intellectual capacity in terms of really making it successful. The other part, so that's a club ADF effort which we are looking at. The other part is in terms of making sure we create genuine literature around entrepreneurship, and this part requires, I believe, a lot of importance and significance. This strikes at the root of the question you also asked, Vaishnavi. What is a real key bottleneck or key lever that will unlock the next cycle of entrepreneurship? I think it has to be a lot of literature around how starting up an entrepreneurship is in a country like India. All of us, including me, started reading up about Silicon Valley entrepreneurship literature, right? The lean startup culture or whatever it may be. And that is the only literature available at that point in time in terms of how to start up, how to look at funding and everything, right? Now, 10, 15 years down the line, all of us really know that building for India, building for an emerging market economy is extremely different from what it's going to be for a developed market or something like a US, right?
Mm.
At this point in time, we know that there is genuine first-hand information in terms of how building for India is going to be different. And this playbook might be far more suitable for an emerging market, economy. And India is also innovating, right? India is actually creating public digital infrastructure like a UPI stack. The other day, I read that UPI has gotten integrated into UA in terms of creating payments and everything. So India is also now leading the world in certain sectors as well. Making sure we document and provide this information knowledge in a referenceable literature format, either through academic partnerships as case studies available. See, I would probably even go on to hypothesize. I was in the same, most of the case studies that we have read were of, let's say, the Cokes and the Pepsis of some, foreign national companies and everything, right? We are yet to come across, case studies in our own B schools or our own engineering, curriculum in terms of, let's say, how Bharat Matrimony was built in a dial-up sort of an era, right? In 90s, he went about creating a whole ecosystem and a hugely successful, profitable company where internet was patchy. At the same time, the challenges related to payments was very different. So this is a very genuine knowledge base that we have to make sure we are documenting. At this point, in time, this is translated to the communities through initiatives like yours and ours, where we do informal talks, which still is a sideshow to the whole curriculum, right? You have an entrepreneurship talk, and then you have majority literature is still centered around a lot of other things. So there has to be a genuine effort in terms of creating literature. And more significantly, the next cycle of wave of entrepreneurship is going to come from the small towns. Today's entrepreneur founders are the mascots and people who others look up to in terms of Himjudi Asabanna, right? Literally, that was one of the interventions I Am Ahmedabad incubator drove when they actually created the book Stay Hungry and Stay Foolish, right? Which was documenting few entrepreneur stories, because these stories need to be accessible for people to aspire and know that such a track exists, right? And I recall one of my founder friends who's also part of our initiative at ADIF, Snehil of Truly Madly Deeply. He was not aware that this was a genuine intervention by CIS supported by Government of India. He was saying that Abhiyar college ke time mein, when I was traveling on the train, from the train station, I remember picking up this particular book. And that's when I first caused the thought that mujhe bhi aisa banna hai. Okay? Now, in the next cycle, we have to understand that the next cycle of entrepreneurship will be fueled from various parts across the country. Because even if you look at the current reality, some of our most prominent companies are located in probably a Bangalore or a Delhi, some in Chennai and Pune or Bombay for that matter. Almost all these founders are coming from the Raipurs of the world, right? Except a few who have been also schooled abroad and done education in the metros. Almost all of them. Take a Vijay Shekhar Sharma, you take a Ritesh Agarwal. Most of them have come from various parts of the country. And they are now the aspirational role models of the next generation of people. What we have to really understand is this literature, what we're talking about, this knowledge we're talking about should be available in languages that people can intuitively think and relate and understand. And that is where I think the next whole set of intervention has to really grow in. And this body of knowledge creation is going to be very central in terms of how ADIF goes about the work in terms of fueling that. Fueling the next wave of entrepreneurship is very central to one of our charter objectives as well. And the best way to transfer knowledge, and there's a lot of literature around it, Informal networks, it's like the water cooler phenomenon, right? Informal networks and informal connections is where most amount of knowledge gets passed, right? If I have a good founder on my captive, right, that is my best insulation against knowledge that kisse paisa lena hai, kisse paisa nahi lena hai, right?
Understood. So in knowledge has to be documented, one,
Correct.
and it has to be dispersed through the right networks, because
Correct.
that is going to act as an inspiration and a prototype for the
Correct.
upcoming for the
These are the
upcoming.
three pillars, what we call
Exactly.
Indus Valley Literature, Club ADIF, and the Policy Lab.
Exactly. And that makes for your playbook.
That's
And
our playbook for ADIF, and the Indus Valley Literature is the playbook in terms of open sourcing that knowledge base as well. But yes, that's a playbook that we have in mind in terms of how we go about
there is another aspect to ADIF, and that is the policy lab. So
it.
talk to us about the policy lab and how you are advocating for a fair ecosystem for the startups, and any particular cases you want to highlight.
So from the policy lab standpoint, I would again break it into three broad areas we want to attack or let's say influence. So one is the part which touched upon briefly, right? When you say that there are a lot of anti-competitive practices in markets, right? And that's a reality we are waking up to globally, not just in India, where internet and network technologies tend to actually favoring only the biggest players to the detriment of taking out opportunities for others to even enter the particular market. So the whole antitrust space or the anti-competition space is an area which we have realized is of significant importance. So that is one area of policy, and we can talk one example there from the Google example. The second area is the understood term is, let's say, ease of doing business, where we fathom is it ease of building in India, right? And making sure we have a founder-friendly market. The way we would want to narrate that is typically when we talk about ease of doing business, we end up thinking about the amount of time it actually takes to, let's say, create an entity or dissolve an entity. While all those is important, fundamentally, startup sector is a knowledge economy. It's a cognitive, intellectual, skill-based economy. Your ability to attract and retain talent is what's going to help you in the long run. Today, we have a situation where a lot of our founders end up setting up companies overseas or re-domiciling. And that is because of a lot of constraints in the whole value chain. You can't just pinpoint one issue and say that, kyun ja rahe. The simplest explanation is people want to go abroad, but no, if you speak to almost all founders, they want to stay and build in India. They sometimes take a choice to do that for the best interest of the companies and shareholders. That is the ease of doing business for founders, making sure we are founder friendly, making sure for founders we are the most favored nation. And that requires a lot of specific interventions, right? So these are the broad two predominant focus areas. The third focus area in the policy lab is progressive policy. Technology is such an evolving space. It's also a very nascent space, right? All put together, the sector is probably what, 10 to 12 years old, or max 15 years old, depending on when you start counting, right? Even the people in the sector are trying to grapple with the amount of change it's going through. Today we have crypto and Web3, and people, even the angel investors, trying to scramble in terms of getting a hang of it, right? So to get the right policy, so today even the government is struggling with that, right? If you look at a crypto policy law or a personal data protection law, what is the right balance for ensuring that the sector can grow is a challenge, and that will require a lot of innovative progressive policies. These are the broad three areas where we get it. And to enable that, we need a lot of original studies and a think tank sort of an approach. Including me, if I end up saying that I know the exact way to navigate in the crypto market, I will be bluffing and I'll be sort of fooling myself. We will need, because globally, everybody's trying to figure this out, right? So
Yeah.
we need to bring people together and actually make sure that we understand and acknowledge and actually create a good roadmap so that we ensure the growth of the sector as well. So these are the three broad areas. If I were to take one specific example, as you asked, what are the interventions that we drove was in the space of, let's say, the antitrust issue, was
Okay.
the Google issue that we picked up. In the app economy, Google and Apple charges 30% commission for all digital transactions with their platform, right? They also have a lot of other restrictions. If you take an example of Apple, for instance, you are not allowed to even install apps from any other source, right? Other than through their own app store. Now, if you look at the Mac ecosystem, you can still download from the web, but it actually has a very tightly controlled ecosystem out there. And Google in India, they had decided to globally, they had decided to start charging 30% to everyone, which would have meant a lot of loss of revenue for all our developers from India and across the globe. But more critically, the anti-competitive nature comes from the fact that Google is forcing out every other payment gateway operator from the app economy, right? They are using dominance in one market to extend their dominance in another market, which is a classic definition of what we call an anti-competitive behavior. And they're also denying developers a choice to pick the service providers of their liking, right? In this particular regard, a lot of people have spoken about it. We at ADIF had picked it up as a particular issue that we wanted to really solve for. We had reached out to the Competition Commission of India. We had formally filed a petition on behalf of our developer friends across the country. And as it stands now, we are still awaiting the final verdict of CCI. As it stands now, the DG investigation has found Google guilty of indulging in anti-competitive behavior. That's one of the specific instances, of this particular aspect on the policy space. We had to do a lot of advocacy with the government and various stakeholders to even bring out the fact that this is happening in this particular market and is affecting a lot of developers. A lot of our work, even before interventions, advocacy. One example. On the second bucket, I would probably say that there are a lot of things that doesn't solve for founders not deciding to stay in India. If I were to highlight one particular small thing which all of us are very familiar with, in November last year, most likely your subscriptions to various platforms will also have broken. Your YouTubes or anything would have broken. Subscription billing is a major pain point in the country till date, right? It's a nightmare. Nobody has been able to navigate, or nobody has been able to figure out, nobody has been able to fathom. It shouldn't have been the case. Okay? Even at this point in time, I have founders in Bangalore. You would also probably would have spoken to them. I have one person extra in my team just to give OTPs to a Panchasarka transaction, right? Now, we can say it's a compliance issue or an overhead issue, but it's not. It is a talent issue because of this, our Indian companies who operate in a SaaS space are not able to compete with their counterparts globally, forcing them to finally take the call of either being uncompetitive in terms of global peers or deciding to domicile abroad so that they have a shot at winning the market and competing. So this is one. The second scenario, if you look at the country, we do not have a monthly subscription seen by a Hotstar or a Prime, not because they want to do an annual billing. It is a market anomaly because monthly subscriptions are either not possible or such a pain. They have decided to depend on one-time payment and non-recurring billing. So the kind of choices that even companies are having to make, the kind of choice the founders are having to make, because it's one small thing not at par. I'm not even talking far superior. On the UPS space, we are far superior, right? Not even at par is resulting in a loss of talent and IP for the entire country. And this is one of the buckets of the several set of issues. If I were to talk, I can talk about this like a white paper itself. But I just want to give a glimpse and a sense of how something which we could potentially see as small is the biggest determinant of why companies like freshness end up deciding to domicile overseas. And that is a frame we wanted to bring as ADI to regulators, to media, to everyone. The focus should be on ensuring that our founders can make the choice of being in India and building in India and building for the world.
Understood. And you touched on with the subscription gaps. True that. I mean, it is a pain point, yes. And
it is a pain point. There is no shying away from that.
Yes, and along with that, the brain drain also that is happening with Web3 coming in. We were hoping, and I still hope that we don't miss that bus.
Exactly.
But as you see, a lot of the talent is moving towards the Middle East or very friendly countries, right?
Correct. So the lens for us to look is what will attract talent and what will drive your talent. It's not just one regulation, X number of time to file a paper, right? It's your ability to play around, right? Web3, while I understand that opening up crypto will have risks on the financial markets, if you restrict the entire market, your ability to play around Web3 and build for the future innovators is going to be completely taken out. And the moment that option is taken out, as you rightly said, talent will move to a Middle East. And you will not even see it, right? It's not the big companies that are moving. It's the young developers that are moving. And you will not even see it. It will be a very invisible loss in some sense. But yes, you already have identified the pattern.
Exactly. Well, while we are at the topic of Web3, let's delve a little deeper into that. Explain or break it down for us ADIF's role in mentoring deep tech startups and how you are mentoring them, especially considering the ever evolving yet nascent stage that India is in.
Yeah, so as you rightly said, ADIF is in a very nascent stage. As an organization, we are only about a year old, and a large part of it did end up, let's say, being in the pandemic phase as well. So yes, we still need to make progress on that one. To answer your question, the area that we're looking at, where the pillar that will fall in, is the club ADIF part of the story. And I'll tell you where I come from in terms of how that's going to translate, right? So even if you look at, let's say, Silicon Valley, right? Um, they did not really necessarily start with deep tech. They were totally driving force. One of the fact that there was a lot of grants that happened right from the Second World War, right? And the DARPA grants, which actually went into creating R&D sort of knowledge base, right? The second factor there, if you look at it, is the fact that we had certain universities. If you look at the story of Silicon Valley, people talk about Sand Hill Road, which is where all the VCs sit, right? Historically, if you have been tracking, VCs were sitting in New York. Nobody was there in, in and around Stanford. It is Stanford that actually created the intellectual powerhouse to actually create all this knowledge base around it. And eventually, VCs converge very close to that. In India, also we've seen that phenomenon. There was a time when I used to start seeing VCs hanging around next to IITs in the coffee shop adjacent and opening office there, right? And this is also another big factor. If you look at the percentage of what do you call GDP that is going into R&D grants, as a proportion, India is still very low. So that's a structural issue, right? We need to try and solve that by advocating and maybe even nudging towards that potentially at a point where some of the companies become way more stronger. Part of the CSR budgets, and I'm thinking of a potential intervention area, not something we could potentially do immediately. At that point, as ADI, we could influence these companies to keep aside a portion of the CSR as a collective exercise into giving R&D grants. Because if you want to create deep tech, it can only happen by giving a lot of grants for people to invest in R&D. So there is one part of the story, right? So that is one areas of where how we start looking at that particular direction. The second part, which is equally more prescient, you use the word starting one conversation, right? We are at a nascent point of the deep tech industry, right? 12 years back, we were at a nascent point of even a startup industry, right? Silicon Valley stood to gain and reap the benefits of the internet IT revolution, internet age, because they started experimenting and playing around in the 80s. It's 20 years later, in 2000, that some companies started maturing and materializing, and the gains started seeing. And if you look at the pattern that went in, right? Earlier, funding were coming from bankers and venture capitalists, and it was going into more understood models, right? It's only when money started moving into the hand of founders and technologists, they started making more and more audacious bets. You just track one of the most popular stories right now is Elon Musk, right, buying Twitter. If you just look Elon's story as well, he didn't start off by creating SpaceX or Tesla on day one. He started by creating something called as a PayPal, leveraging web technologies. The more and more money and resource he had at disposal, and more social capital he commanded, he started making more and more audacious bets, right, in terms of what he's going to do downstream. And this same cycle is where we'll see more and more capital. As and when it keeps moving into the hands of technologists and founders, you will see them making more audacious bets, either in terms of the companies that they themselves create, or in terms of the companies that decide to back. One instance in India is Aether Energy. They are the leading the market in terms of who they are. That is a proper deep tech company. They're leading the curve. And the reason they could do that is because people like Sachin went ahead and said that, boys, we go ahead and do it. I'm here to sort of back you, right? We could not have imagined that reality 20 years back, right? Because it's only, founders who will start making more audacious bets in terms of the vision of the founder backing the founder. In the last 3 to 4 years, if you look at what has significantly shifted in the Indian startup ecosystem, the number of exits have started increasing. Founders are finally genuinely making wealth. If you look at the proportion of angel investments done by founders, in the last 3 to 4 years, vis-a-vis the 4 years before that, the proportion is significantly higher. That's also resulted in a different set of valuation numbers and everything, because as early stage founders, you know that valuations are also anyways up in the air unless and until you make a successful company and build it out. All this is going to be, only on paper. So we are beginning to see the early stages of that happening, right? And this multiplier cycle is what, as ADIF, we want to sort of accelerate. And that's where the club ADIF comes in. We would want to see more and more founders making more audacious bets. We want to see more and more founders being on cap tables of companies and even guiding the others. Ola was backed by people like Harpreet Singh, right? He had run a company called CoQs, and he went and said that you have to go ahead and keep building this stuff, and you have to give a long rope and a longer horizon. This is the person philosophy where I also come from, and these are the levers we will enable as ADIF. And what specific sector and technology each person wants to back will be dictated by the founder, and that's the function of the private market, right? It's not for an organization to dictate where the capital needs to go. Government will have strategic priorities in terms of, okay, these sectors are important for national security. But Shailesh Vikram Singh, one of the founders at ADIF, he's decided to completely back anything in climate space because he believes that that's the biggest problem that needs to be solved. He has created a fund only to back mobility and climate, right? And he's a super fabricator. So the thing that differentiates founders as compared to, let's say, traditional venture capitalists, founders are creating capital and putting capital, yes, to also make return because that is what the market respects, but to also shape a reality that they would wish to see, right? And this is the single biggest determining factor. So bringing founders more and more front and center into these processes is where our interventions and our guiding principles will be Vaishnavi. And that's where our philosophy sort of comes in.
All right, understood, and that's interesting because deep tech needs to evolve, and that's the aim of DQ Deep Tech as well. That we need to build an ecosystem where every stakeholder comes together, and finally we make India the deep tech destination of the world. Though currently the appetite is large in the global market, but eventually it comes down to India.
We have to be patient also, right? These deep tech technologies don't happen overnight. I mean, I was listening to once, Sridhar Velbu speaking, right? He was saying that precision, cutting technology, it's a lifetime of work in terms of improving the process intelligence. So these kinds of deep tech skills will happen over a period of time. So that's why I wanted to stress the word that you said, right? It is patient capability. It is also at the nascent stage of where we are right now. And we have to do building blocks. And all of the founders, I'm pretty sure, at least a large majority of them really, really want to solve the structural challenge.
Understood. Also needs patient capital.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So much, Sijo, for taking time out for this conversation. And we learned amazing insights on the startup playbook, on how to advocate for policies for the startup ecosystem and the ever evolving deep tech market. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for all the work that you do. Once again, thanks for hosting. It was a pleasure talking to you guys.